Let's go to our top story this morning. The Wall Street Journal is out with a new piece entitled Behind Closed Doors, Biden Shows Signs of Slipping. The Journal says it spoke with both Republicans and Democrats who either participated in meetings with Biden or were briefed on them contemporaneously, but essentially only on the record. Republican critics in the article. The one is former Speaker Kevin McCarthy. The Journal writes, quote, last year when Biden was negotiating with House Republicans to lift the debt ceiling, his demeanor and command of the details seemed to shift from one day to the next, according to then House Speaker Kevin McCarthy.
By the way, they also quoted Mike Johnson, people around Mike Johnson, and admit that this was basically House Republicans whacking.
Why didn't they just ask Marjorie Taylor Greene?
Well, exactly.
Why
did? They could have.
And Lauren Boebert.
Yeah, it's really shocking, especially when you see what Kevin McCarthy has said repeatedly, publicly, and behind the scenes about Biden on those same days when they were negotiating.
The strong feelings you're seeing about this article comes also because the context of this race and these two candidates. It's interesting. That's all I'll say. Anyhow, that flies in the face of what McCarthy said about Biden's effectiveness in the past. From Politico last year, quote, McCarthy mocked Biden's age and mental acuity in public.
In public, like he did in this article.
While privately telling allies that he found the president sharp and substantive in their conversations, a contradiction that left a deep impression on the White House. This from the New York Times. Privately, Mr. McCarthy has told allies that he has found Mr. Biden to be mentally sharp in meetings. And this from The Hill. Very professional, very smart, very tough at the same time. McCarthy told reporters at the Capitol of his talks with Biden.
You know, Willie, I could go on and on with things that Kevin McCarthy and others have said about negotiating with Joe Biden. I could also talk about what the French delegation said when they were negotiating with him and what they told me and friends that I have in that French delegation who were part of those negotiations who said that Macron came out like, wow, okay, it's a lot tougher than we expected. And actually, I think Macron sort of got his back up because Biden was pressing so hard. Can tell you the same thing about Middle Eastern leaders that I talked to. Nobody's saying he's not cogent. Some people are suggesting that he, you know, a bit too tough in negotiations, that the United States throws their weight around a little bit too much. But what I find so shocking about this article is they go to Kevin McCarthy as their main source and other House Republicans, the same House Republicans, Mike Johnson, who just there lied through his teeth repeatedly, Mike Johnson, who got to power based on the big lie. And they're using people around Johnson and Kevin McCarthy to do this Trump hit piece on Joe Biden. But again, here's the quote. Kevin McCarthy mocked Biden's age and mental acuity in public. This is from Politico last year, while privately telling allies that in private he found the president to be sharp and substantive. And I've talked to you about my meetings with the president over the past year, Willie, and I've talked to Mike and Meek about it, and I said it in real time. The guy, see both those guys right there? I've spent time with both of those guys privately. I've spent time with Biden and Trump privately. I've spent time with every House Speaker over the past 30 years and Joe Biden. It's just not close. If you want to talk about international affairs, if you want to talk about how to get bipartisan legislation, Joe Biden is light years ahead of all of them. And the fact that the Wall Street Journal knew these quotes were out there, that editors, I'm not looking at the reporter. People always blame the reporter. There are a line of editors behind every story that's done. The editors saw that Kevin McCarthy had a habit of saying one thing in public, lying in public, and then privately telling his aides just the opposite. That Biden was sharp, that he was cogent, that he was substantive. And in the same meeting that Kevin McCarthy is now telling the Wall Street Journal Biden was out of it, he went out And he told reporters after the meeting that the meeting was, quote, the best yet. We're making progress, and I'm going to be talking to Joe Biden every day. Very professional, very smart, very tough. I don't even know what to say. I really don't even know what to say here.
Well, let's begin with the fact that Joe Biden is 81 years old. Donald Trump, by the way, will be 78 next week, so he's not much younger. So, yes, does he move a little slower and speak a little softer than he did 15 years ago when he was vice president, as former Speaker McCarthy says in the piece? Sure does. Yeah, I think most 81-year-olds do, or most people are different than they were 15 years ago. This does have the feeling of Trump acolytes laundering their attacks through a reputable, prestigious news organization in the Wall Street Journal. Also, the point about notes, as Richard Haas would tell you, presidents use notes in meetings. That's not unusual. They might have a sheet, they might have a card in front of them with some points that they want to make. I would also point out Donald Trump has a person who follows him with a printer to print things out for him so he can have hard copies, so he can read his notes and facts and lies often that he rattles off. And then the other point to make is, will the Wall Street Journal have a piece about Donald Trump and his mental acuity? All you have to do is watch the 90 minutes of that Fox News interview over the weekend, and you could go through and do an entire series of articles on someone who doesn't seem to have it all together. Mike Barnicle, you're very plugged into the White House. What's the early reaction to this piece?
You can't say it on the air. You just can't say it on the air what your reaction is, actually. But, you know, I am sort of actually embarrassed for the Wall Street Journal with this piece. And there's one, at least to me and others, Richard, anyone who has spent any time at all, Joe, Mika, anybody who has spent any time at all with Joe Biden knows one thing about Joe Biden above all else. He's a talker. He's a talker. So here's the tell in this piece. With Ukraine running out of munitions, the White House called together top lawmakers to discuss what it would take to get congressional funding, along with the scope of border security changes demanded by Republicans. The president moved so slowly around the cabinet room to greet the nearly 24 congressional leaders that it took about 10 minutes for the meeting to begin, some people who attended recalled. 24 people around a table, and it took them 10 minutes to go around. I'm amazed that it didn't take them an hour. Everyone he meets, he has 10 minutes to talk to them about. Everyone. So this was a classic hit piece, probably ordered up by the 93-year-old, fifth-time married Rupert Murdoch over the weekend. Probably, you know? But, I mean, this piece is so tilted, so off the mark. Is he 81 years old? Yes. Is he a bit slower in terms of his reactions to some things? Probably. That I don't know. We don't know. I do know, Richard, and you've talked to people, I'm sure, who have been with him in national security meetings. I've been with people who have been with him in the Situation Room, where he literally goes around the globe on the chart in the Situation Room. I've never been in there, but electronically, and points out the weaknesses and the strengths of the United States relationships with each and every country that he's talking about, with no notes. With no notes. He's an 81-year-old president of the United States who gets up every day. He's got to deal with Bibi Netanyahu in the morning, Ukraine, about 10 minutes later. His son is on trial. His son is an addict. It's on his mind all the time. This piece is outrageous.
Yeah, but Mike, it's not that complicated. It's just not, you know, we don't have to talk.
Look at who they quote.
We don't have to talk to anybody, Richard, but the person they quote, Kevin McCarthy, who is the source. Again, Kevin McCarthy, who is on actually a sort of a PR tour right now to clean up the fact, and Politico's written a story about this, the fact that he lies. The fact that he bounces back and forth. He's trying to go on basically a PR tour. But we don't have to ask world leaders, but please feel free to jump in. Let's just talk to the guy that was the source of this story and quoted. McCarthy mocked Biden's age and mental acuity in public while privately telling allies in private he found the president to be sharp and substantive. He called him very professional, very smart, very tough. And this same meeting, again, that the Wall Street Journal is basing this story on Kevin McCarthy's lies. Kevin McCarthy's lies. which it's in the press. There is a mountain of quotes from Kevin McCarthy and people around Kevin McCarthy saying that Biden is sharp. He's mentally sharp, privately. So go ahead, talk about what I've talked about, talking to world leaders, talking to, but again, it's just not complicated.
No, it's not.
They went to a guy who has admitted that he lies in public and that privately Biden is very sharp.
Joe, 2 Republican speakers have been up for recall in the recent past. Kevin McCarthy and Mike Johnson. Democrats saved Mike Johnson with their votes. They refused to save Kevin McCarthy when he was up, and he's out. Why? Because it was universal, even from Republicans and Democrats. Kevin McCarthy is a liar. That's why he didn't get the support.
It's also really odd this story comes out now. Think about the last week. Joe Biden has come forward with 3 major new policies: a ceasefire initiative in the Middle East, a new weapons targeting policy for Ukraine, and an entirely different policy on the border. 3 enormous issues, 3 new policies. This, you may like the policies, you may not, but this is clearly a president who is driving an agenda.
Some of the police officers who defended that building behind Alley on January 6 are continuing their fight to protect democracy. Harry Dunn, Aquilino Ganell, and Daniel Hodges have been fanning out across swing states recently to make the case for re-electing President Biden in November and for stopping Donald Trump. Today, coming off an unsuccessful bid for Congress, which saw him bring in more than $5 million for the campaign, Dunn is launching a new political action committee called Dunn's Democracy Defenders.
I was always ready for game day. 2 teams lined up. It's us against them. You leave it all on the field. I'm Harry Dunn, and on January 6th, the good guys won. My fellow officers and I fought those insurrectionists as a team. We had each other's back, and we didn't do it for one person or one president. We did it for our country, to make sure everyone's vote counted. That's what democracy is. That no one person's voice is greater than another. When I ran for Congress, hundreds of thousands of regular people stood with me, and we broke records in fundraising. But our system still allows the wealthiest Americans and their corrupt super PACs to support insurrectionists and drown out our voices. So, our team has got to change that. We need to support candidates committed to getting money out of politics and defending our democracy from Donald Trump and MAGA extremists. Nobody said it would be easy, but for our country, for our team, we can't stop now.
And former U.S. Capitol Police Officer Harry Dunn joins us now. He's the author of the recent book, Standing My Ground. Officer Dunn, thanks for being with us again this morning. So you ran for Congress in the state of Maryland, fell a little bit short there, but did have some money left over from that campaign. So tell us more about what you plan to do with it in this initiative.
Sure. Thanks for having me on. It's always good to be on with you all. Yeah, we did fall short, but the reason why I ran was to do everything I can do to continue to fight for democracy, to fight to preserve our Constitution, and to fight to stop MAGA extremists and at the very top of the ticket, Donald Trump. And yeah, we did raise millions of dollars in a very short period of time. And what that told me is that a lot of people across the country, that message of our democracy, the threat of losing it, the threat of this being our potential last free and fair election. It resonates with a lot of people. It worries a lot of people, and it's at the top of people's minds. So what we're going to do is to continue to use that momentum to continue to go across the country, up and down the ballot, and elect Democrats and stop MAGA Republicans. And also use the fight to continue to get big corporate money out of politics and support those candidates that really want to do that.
So, Harry, when you were out there running for Congress and meeting a lot of people and talking to a lot of people, that aspect that you just mentioned, the threat to democracy, when you would talk to people about the threat to democracy, how many of the people you spoke to thought it was like real, that it could happen, as opposed to...
No, it worries a lot of people. It worries a lot of people because, like I said, a lot of the issues that, we talk about, codifying Roe v. Wade and common sense gun reform, lowering inflation, all of those things really, as important as they are, if we have a dictator in the White House, a dictator over democracy, what is the purpose? Those issues really don't even matter because the dictator gets what he wants. So everybody is definitely worried. Even people that voted against me for one of my opponents tell me that they were definitely worried about our democracy. So I think it is very front and center with a lot of people. And being out here on the campaign trail for President Biden, I'm in Pennsylvania right now. One of the things people are definitely worried about it. It resonates with people. And as people have talked about, he's talking about retribution and imprisoning his political opponents. And people are really worried about that.
Officer, we keep hearing about a kind of sense of amnesia, not just around President Trump, but even around the events of January the 6th. When you're out on the campaign trail, speaking to voters in Pennsylvania, how much are they thinking about it? How much do they remember what happened that day? How central is it in their thinking as they plan to go to the elections in November?
One of the things that we've been hearing a lot is a lot of people say Democrats need to move on from January 6th. But Donald Trump talks about it every day that he holds a rally. He is front and center about pardoning the rioters that attacked the police officers on January 6th. So Donald Trump is making it a campaign issue also. Let's be completely clear about that. But people want to know the truth. And there are voters out there that no matter what Donald Trump says, no matter what he does, will not stray from him, no matter what. That's fine. But the people that we are trying to reach, the independent voters, the Republicans who don't have a political home, that the people that believe that democracy is really on the ballot, people that believe in that, those are the people we're trying to reach out here now. And I'm hoping to amplify that with DemocracyDefendersPAC.com.
Former U.S. Capitol Police Officer Harry Dunn, thank you very much for being on the show this morning. So the group, Republican Voters Against Trump, is launching a new billboard ad campaign looking to persuade moderate Republicans and Republican-leaning voters in 4 swing states. The billboards feature former Trump voters who now say they won't vote for him in the wake of his conviction last week in his New York City criminal trial. Let's bring in the executive director of Republican Voters Against Trump, Sarah Longwell. She's also a publisher at The Bulwark and host of the Focus Group podcast. Sarah, thank you so much for joining us to tell us more about this campaign and what you're hearing from Republican voters.
Well, look, the question after the conviction, the political question, is will voters care? And from our perspective, you have to help make them care, right? The Republicans are out there right now, and they are building their own narrative, building their own echo chamber. They are all singing from the same song sheet that this was rigged, that we have a 2-tier justice system. But we have to go on offense right now and make sure that voters understand how unique, how historically unique in a desperately dark way it is to have a convicted felon running for president. And so our program, Republican Voters Against Trump, it hinges on a key theory around permission structures, which is you need credible messengers to speak to these swing voters. And so we have hundreds of people who voted for Trump in the past. Many of them have voted for him twice, who are explaining, and there's testimonials all over our website, explaining why they won't vote for Trump again. But after the conviction, we wanted to make sure that it stuck with people. I mean, we have watched Donald Trump, extraordinary things have happened, like his own vice president not endorsing him. And yet it kind of just rolls off voters' minds. You know, Trump's been around for a long time. We have 2 functional incumbents, and that creates a dynamic where voters just aren't as tuned in ways that they might have. And so you have to go on offense. You have to have strong affirmative messaging to make sure that things stick in the mind of voters. You can't just count on the idea that voters are going to hear conviction and walk away. You have to help them understand why this is so extraordinary, why what he did was wrong, and why he's too dangerous to be in the White House again.
So, Sarah, to that point about the difficulty in making things stick to Trump, we also live in a world where it seems like everyone's attention span is a few fleeting moments, and then we all just sort of move on to the next thing. So it's not just there's a conviction. It's a conviction that happened at the end of May. Here we are in the first few days of June. We're still 5 months to the election. So how do you get it to resonate, to stay in the forefront of voters' minds, not just now, but as they head into the ballot box?
Well, look, this is one of the ways that Democrats, I think, have to figure out how they're going to do their messaging strategy. I think that oftentimes they get really fractured around messaging and have a difficult time going on offense as opposed to playing defense. And so part of this is to make sure that acknowledging Donald Trump's conviction is a regular feature in the way that Democrats are talking about him. And not just Joe Biden. You know, Joe Biden, as a messenger, has a particular role, I think, to explain to the country what he's going to do over the next 4 years. But Democrats need an army of surrogates who are out there making an affirmative case, going on offense, going on attack against Donald Trump, making sure the country understands that he's a convicted felon and that he's been convicted of sexual assault, and that he's been convicted for, the things that he did with the Trump org, and reminding people of the salience of January 6th. You know, it is really this is going to be a choice about who people dislike more, who's the lesser of two evils, and you've got to help voters understand that Trump is the greater of the evils.
Yeah, and just to get that list complete: liable of sexual abuse, defamation, and massive fraud, and then a convicted felon who is openly hell-bent on revenge. That's what we're dealing with. That's what voters have to consider. Executive Director of Republican Voters Against Trump, Sarah Longwell, thank you very much for being on this morning. President Biden issued an executive order yesterday that will shut down asylum requests at the southern border when crossings spike. Under the order, border officials will stop accepting requests when daily encounters reach an average of 2,500 migrants at legal points of entry. The shutdown will go into effect immediately. As Department of Homeland Security officials say, encounters have reached 4,000 migrants daily. The border will only reopen once the number falls to 1,500 migrants. Joining us now is Homeland Security Secretary Alejandro Mayorkas. Thank you very much for being on the show. Obviously, this has had mixed reaction, even from Democrats. But explain how this works. What happens as this executive order goes into effect? What happens to the excessive number of migrants trying to make a cross over the border?
Mika, good morning, and thank you for having me. The goal here is to reduce the number of people who come to the southern border of the United States and cross illegally. Our goal is to drive people who seek and need humanitarian relief into the lawful, safe, and orderly pathways that we have built. And so individuals who arrive at our border and cross illegally will be barred from asylum, with exceptions. However, 1,400 people who have made appointments through our CBP One app will be able to seek asylum in the United States through our ports of entry. Individuals who have accessed our parole program for Cubans, Haitians, Nicaraguans, and Venezuelans will be able to access asylum relief in the United States. We have built an unprecedented number of lawful pathways, but we are going to secure our border and reduce the number of people who are encountered at it.
Mr. Secretary, good morning. I think the question for a lot of people, and not just conservatives here, but is what took so long to get to this place? So we can go well before the legislation that a group of senators, bipartisan group of senators, work hard to present, and then, of course, Republicans in the Congress turn their backs on it on the instruction of Donald Trump. But going back even further than that, a system that allows people to show up at the border, claim asylum, sometimes legitimately, sometimes not, and then move into the country because they know it's going to take years for their asylum hearing to come up. Why did it take so long to get to this place, which does seem rational to many people?
Well, 2 points. First of all, you have seized accurately upon the fundamental problem with our asylum system, that it takes years and years, and we need Congress to fix it. Only Congress can provide the enduring solution, which is legislation. But let's take a look at the chronology. On day one of his administration, the president presented Congress with a comprehensive legislation to fix our broken immigration system. Since then, and up until May of last year, we have been operating under the public health order of Title 42. When that order was lifted in May of last year, we drove the numbers down, despite some predictions that pandemonium would ensue. Shortly thereafter, the president implored Congress to fund this department and other departments that administer our immigration laws, as we need to be resourced. He, in August, submitted a supplemental funding package. Then again in October, he submitted another supplemental funding package. And neither was picked up by Congress, most regrettably, most unfortunately. We then went into an arduous, hard-working process to develop bipartisan Senate legislation that would have fundamentally fixed our asylum system and once and for all properly resourced this department and the Departments of Justice and State. Twice, Congress failed to pass that legislation, and so the president took this executive action within his lawful authorities.
Mr. Secretary, good morning. You just outlined the domestic political challenges with what's happening at the border. But of course, the United States is not alone in this. There's also Mexico, and they just had a new election. So can you tell us the relationship and the guidelines you're going to use as you approach the new administration there? Are you hopeful that they will cooperate?
We have built a very strong and productive partnership with Mexico, with President López Obrador. We expect that strong and productive partnership to continue under the presidency of Claudia Sheinbaum. And this challenge of migration is a regional challenge, and it requires regional solutions, not just in partnership with Mexico, but in partnership with other countries, such as Costa Rica, Panama, Colombia, Guatemala, Ecuador, and the like. We are experiencing, not just at the southern border, but throughout our hemisphere and around the world, an unprecedented level of migration, an unprecedented number of displaced people, and regional challenges require regional solutions.
Homeland Security Secretary Alejandro Mayorkas, thank you very much for coming on the show this morning. We appreciate it.
Thank you.
All right. All right, let's get to our top story on this second hour of Morning Joe. Donald Trump is again suggesting his political opponents could be jailed if he wins re-election as retribution for last week's guilty verdict against him in New York City. In an interview with the far-right network Newsmax last night, Trump continued to claim he didn't receive a fair trial, complaining the jurors never smiled at him. He also threatened to prosecute his perceived foes, including former Secretary of State Hillary Clinton, who had nothing to do with the verdict against him.
Mother Teresa couldn't get a fair trial here. I said that. And no, you couldn't. I never saw a glimmer of a smile from the jury. It was a trial that everybody said shouldn't have been brought, including Bragg didn't want to bring it. Nobody wanted to bring it until I decided to run, and then was beating everybody by a lot, and then was beating Biden by a lot in the polls. But, you know, it's a very terrible thing. It's a terrible precedent for our country. Does that mean the next president does it to them? That's really the question. Wouldn't it be terrible to throw the president's wife and the former Secretary of State? Think of it, the former Secretary of State, but the president's wife into jail. Wouldn't that be a terrible thing? But they want to do it. So, you know, it's a terrible, terrible path that they're leading us to. And it's very possible that it's going to happen to them.
Yeah, so there we go. Once again, Willie, Donald Trump threatening to jail his political opponents, as he has repeatedly over the past several months, several years. What's so interesting is that, again, here's the big lie that Donald Trump tells about these prosecutions, all the prosecutions against him, Willie, is that... is Willie there? Did Willie leave?
He's here.
I was.
No, we got
There he
Willie.
is. Oh,
I
good.
was
Hi,
with Monty.
Willie.
Yeah.
Give you a second. I've been talking about Willie since 6:03. So anyway, in 2019 on this show, we said if Donald Trump lost, he would run again for re-election to avoid all the prosecutions against him. When he ran, there was open discussion about why is Donald Trump running again? The answer was because if he runs again, he will be able to say that all of these prosecutions that are coming are politically influenced. So we all saw this coming. People all saw this coming. For him to now say, oh, they're only coming after me, for his allies to say, oh, they're only coming after him because he's running for president, actually has that backwards. He ran for president because he knew he was going to be prosecuted.
Yeah, that's the bet. If he wins, it all goes away. And he's actually outside of the case that was just decided with the 34 felony guilty verdicts against him last week. He successfully has used delay tactics, his team has, to probably get these pushed past the election. He thinks if he wins, Merrick Garland's out, he puts, I don't know, Don Jr. in as Attorney General or something, and everything goes away. And Jonathan, there is actually, Axios has a little bit of reporting this morning, quoting Steve Bannon, take it for what it's worth, but a voice of a MAGA world saying that they're going to go after Alvin Bragg first and try to put him in jail. So, you know, this is, a lot of people go, oh, it's Donald Trump popping off. It's what he does. He's calling into Newsmax. But you got to take this stuff seriously, given not only who he is, but who he has surrounded himself with.
Yeah, we've learned that when he makes a threat like this, we have to take it seriously. And what's different here, I mean, there's been Republican anger for years now. They claim the witch hunts against Donald Trump. But what's different about this verdict is just how out in the open it is and how they're not trying to be subtle. There's no euphemisms here. There's no sort of like, let's be clever. They're flat out saying, we are going to go after those who have done this to Donald Trump. Yes, Steve Bannon talking about Alvin Bragg. We have Speaker Johnson, the House Speaker, yesterday saying they're going to look at the Department of Justice and try to defund a lot of what it can do as payback, they say, for the Biden DOJ going after Donald Trump. Now, of course, there's a limit to what they can actually do, but the threat is still there, and it erodes Americans' faith in our institutions. This has been one of the most dominant themes, Mike, of the Trump era, is going after, perceiving, whether it's the FBI or the media, and they have singled out those of us there as well as targets for retribution, and trying to get Americans to say, hey, look, they're not on our side, they're for them, and really vilify everyone, and it's putting us in a very dangerous place.
The most dominant aspect, I would suggest, not one of the most dominant aspect. And largely this is my personal view now, but at some point, Americans have to ask themselves, what kind of a country do we want? And on this particular day, it's almost sacrilegious to be talking about what Donald Trump said and what he means and what he's going to do. We just spoke to a man who just finished a book on Eisenhower, talking about the night before D-Day, when General Eisenhower went through the 101st Airborne, shaking hands, and he knew that every other hand he shook was a young 18, 19, or 20-year-old paratrooper who was going to die within 12 hours on the beaches in Normandy or in St. Mary-Glise, somewhere in Normandy. We were going to lose a young American. Why were they going? They were going to fight for democracy. All these years later, 80 years later, democracy is again in peril. That's a fact. That's a fact. Listening to Donald Trump, that's a fact that we have to live with. And that's a fact that Americans are going to have to make up their minds about. What kind of a country do we want going forward?
And John, we may hear some of that theme from President Biden tomorrow at Normandy when he delivers his address. He'll be there all week, as you reported yesterday. He'll be at Belleau Woods. Later in the week, the World War I site, which is sacred to the United States Marine Corps, will be there all week talking about the young men who frankly saved the world in those days, weeks, and months, but also about bringing it to today and the threats to democracy here.
As Mike said, it's hard not to almost be emotional thinking about this scene with Eisenhower talking to those paratroopers. We're going to hear the president several times this week. His remarks tomorrow are actually going to be, I'm told, relatively brief. He'll be one of a number of world leaders who will speak on the D-Day anniversary itself. It's the next day, the Friday, where he goes to Pointe du Hoc, which is where Ronald Reagan delivered his famous speech, where he's going to deliver a major address, talking about, yes, the sacrifices of 80 years ago that helped save the world, but connecting it to today, the battle we're seeing in Ukraine, but also just the need to affirm and rebuild democracies across the globe. And I'm told the odds are against him invoking Donald Trump by name, but Trump will shadow this speech as he will draw an implicit contrast to the future that Trump would bring versus the one that he would. One with allies, one with defending democracy. We certainly know Donald Trump would take a very different approach to the Ukraine war were he to be returned to office. We know he almost pulled out of NATO a few years ago on the eve of going to Helsinki and siding with Putin over his own government. We're going to hear that in grand terms, Joe, from President Biden in what aides tell me will be one of the most important speeches he delivers this year. One that will not on its surface be a campaign speech, but is going to lay out some of the most important themes of the election ahead.
Yeah, and Caddy, we just talk about the choices. Mike talking about the choices. We talk about the choices. We hear what he said about Hillary Clinton. You have Jonathan O'Meara talking about NATO. Of course, Donald Trump trying to undermine NATO, said he wanted to undermine NATO, said a couple of months ago that he encouraged Vladimir Putin. He would encourage Vladimir Putin to invade NATO countries if they didn't have this sort of defense structure that he wants them to have. Of course, he talked about putting Hillary Clinton in jail, throwing political opponents in jail. His people have talked about throwing us in jail, throwing people that run this show in jail. They've talked about throwing media companies in jail that are insufficiently loyal. He talks about executing chairmen of the Joint Chiefs of Staff who are insufficiently politically loyal to him. He talks about terminating the Constitution. He talks about using SEAL Team 6 to execute political opponents and says that he would be immune from that. He actually had his lawyers argue that in court. You can go through all of it, and it is it's extraordinary. It's extraordinary that this man is talking like an autocrat, talking like Putin, and that right now this race is too close to call.
Texas radio host Ryan Hamilton is speaking out against his state's strict abortion laws after personally seeing how they affected his family. In a lengthy social media post, Ryan revealed his wife Jess had suffered an incomplete miscarriage and their second child no longer had a heartbeat. Quote, what needed to happen, what was best for her and her health, was to terminate the pregnancy and get the baby out. He goes on to talk about the second doctor they saw during an emergency hospital visit. Quote, you could hear him in the hallway as he said, I'm not giving her a pill so she can go home and have an abortion, being well aware that our baby no longer had a heartbeat. They tried a third doctor at a new hospital. Quote, it's becoming clear that their primary concern is not my wife's health, he said. Instead, they seem to be worried about the legalities involved. After being sent home for the third time, Ryan details a terrifying moment where he found his wife passed out on the ground. Quote, having to pick my wife's cold, limp body off that bathroom floor, not sure if I was about to lose her, is something I will never forget. She had to be rushed to the hospital. By this point, she had lost so much blood and bodily fluid, her body gave out. Now, not only do we have to live with the loss of our baby, we have to live with the nightmare of what we just experienced because of political and religious beliefs. My wife's health should have come first, period. Supporters of abortion rights have highlighted tragic stories like this in an attempt to make the issue key headed into the November election. Today, Democratic senators will take another step, holding a vote on a bill meant to protect contraceptives. The move is in reaction to Donald Trump saying in a recent interview that he would be open to restrictions on contraception, only to backtrack the comments hours later. Today's bill is not expected to garner enough Republican support to pass, but Democrats want GOP senators on the record. Joining us now, Democratic Senator Elizabeth Warren of Massachusetts. It's good to have you on the show. We are clearly no longer talking in hypotheticals when it comes to Donald Trump's promises, as we are now living through this. So tell us what's at stake with what you're trying to do.
So look, we are only 60 years since the Supreme Court protected access to contraception. 50 years since they protected access to abortion. We saw what the Supreme Court did on abortion, and now there's a real risk they may do the same thing on contraception. Indeed, one of the justices has already said so. But more to the point, I'm really sick of this idea that the Republicans think they can say two things simultaneously. They can talk to their extremist group and say, I'll give you everything you want. We are going to ban abortion, IVF, contraception, everything you want. And then try to say to the rest of America that says, boy, we don't want any part in that. They say, no, we really don't mean it. We're very moderate. We're not going to do that. Calm down. There's not a problem here. Well, my view is I don't want to hear your words. I want to see what you're going to do. So today we're putting a bill on the floor of the Senate that's going to have every senator vote. Are you willing to support a federal law to protect access to contraception? Yes or no? And we'll see where the Republicans stand on this.
So, of course, Senator, you're talking about Clarence Thomas, who in the concurring opinion of Dobbs said now that we've overturned the constitutional right to abortion, we can look at contraception next. Right. The timing of your legislation obviously couldn't be more vital. The lead story at the top of the Washington Post this morning, conservative attacks on birth control could threaten access. And they go down the list of states from Idaho to Louisiana to Missouri who are spreading misinformation, state legislatures taking that misinformation to pass bills that actually curb the right to contraceptions.
Yeah. You know, the thing about this is it's not just in a handful of states where the threat exists. It's all over the country. We've talked about the fact that abortion will be on the ballot in 2024. So will IVF and so will contraception. If the Republicans get in charge, look at what they've already said they want to do. There is a bill pending in the House that is a life begins at conception bill. And it is supported by the majority of Republicans in the House, including the Speaker of the House. That bill would make it impossible, for example, to use IUDs or to use Plan B. They would just be automatically treated as murder. So it is important that we get everybody on the record and make it clear all across this country. Abortion is on the ballot, IVF is on the ballot, contraception is on the ballot. And the majority of Americans who don't want an extremist minority to be able to control them and to advance their agenda over that of and the decisions of everyone else, that's what's at stake in 2024. And that's why we're voting today.
And again, there's always this characterization of, oh, look at the extremists in rural states here. Look at the extremists there. Let's look instead at Virginia, for instance. Glenn Youngkin, who's supposed to be, he's an investment banker, or he's a more moderate Republican. He's not crazy like the rest of those people. Glenn Youngkin actually vetoed a bill that would guarantee women in Virginia the right to contraception. And his justification was he had to veto it because he thought giving women the right that they've had since 1965 would, quote, trample on the religious freedoms of Virginians. That's how crazy this has become.
Yeah. Yeah. And that's how extreme it has become. You know, more than 90% of Americans want to make sure that people get access to contraception. So here's this group, it's less than 10% of our country, that actually are the ones who are steering where things are going. And Donald Trump and the Republicans are not just playing along with it, they're actually empowering it and making it come to pass. Always remember that when Trump ran back in 2016, he said that he would appoint the right justices, and that is exactly what he did. He put the justices in place that overturned Roe, and people all across this country are now dealing with the fallout from that. And they're not quitting there. They want more and more and more. They're not quitting just at the state level. They're coming after all of the states nationally. They want to ban abortion. They want to ban contraception. They want to ban IVF. And it's up to us both to out them on that and then take it to the ballot box in November 2024.
Well, I think, Mika, what the senator said is so important. I know the senator, like you, like me, believe everybody has a religious right to believe what they believe. And I know that some Catholics, a small percentage of Catholics, have long believed that taking contraceptives is a sin. Okay, that this is America. Certainly your religious right to believe that, but don't try to have it both ways. Don't say, oh, no, we're not going to follow along with the 10% or the 7% or the 5% in America who believes that, and then quietly behind the scene push through legislation on state levels or veto that very right.
We've already seen what Donald Trump has been able to do with women's rights. So if the fact that he's liable of sexual abuse, massive fraud, defamation, and found guilty on 34 felony counts is not enough, perhaps think about more rights that he can take away from women, including the one we're talking about here today. Senator Elizabeth Warren, thank you.
So, Senator, what's next with this legislation, really quickly, before we know you have to go, but what's next?
So we're going to go ahead and bring it to the floor. We're going to have everybody vote on it. Everybody is on the record. And the plan is we're going to do the same with IVF. We're going to do the same once again with abortion. We don't want there to be any ambiguity here. When you look at the senators, when you look at the presidential candidates, you know exactly which side they stand on. This is the contrast.
Senator, let's be clear. I'm so glad you brought up IVF. Let's be clear. The Republicans in the Senate keep killing bills that would guarantee families across America the right, the protected right to have IVF treatment.
Yes. Today, we're going to do contraception and get them on the record on contraception. We are also going to get them on the record on IVF, and we are going to get them on the record once again on abortion. Because no one should be fooled here. This is what the election this November is about whether or not a tiny minority in this country is going to determine access to family planning, health, reproductive rights for half the population in this country. And I think that's a no for most Americans, and that means they need to vote with the Democrats come November.
So we'll be following these votes and making sure we cover the outcome of each of these votes, and would love to have you back so we can highlight those who voted no and yes on each of these issues, so people are very clear exactly as to what's at stake. Senator Elizabeth Warren, thank you very much for coming on this morning. We appreciate what you're doing.
Thank you.
Soldiers, sailors, and airmen of the Allied Expeditionary Force, you are about to embark upon the great crusade toward which we have striven these many months. The eyes of the world are upon you. The hopes and prayers of liberty-loving people everywhere march with you. In company with our brave allies and brothers in arms on other fronts, you will bring about the destruction of the German war machine, the elimination of Nazi tyranny over the oppressed peoples of Europe, and security for ourselves in a free world.
That is General Dwight David Eisenhower's message to Allied troops on the eve of what would be one of the most pivotal moments of the 20th century, the storming of the beaches at Normandy, which paved the way for the liberation of France and ultimately all of Europe. President Biden is in France this morning, right now, set to deliver remarks in Normandy tomorrow to commemorate the 80th anniversary of D-Day. Joining us now, historian and professor of law at Columbia Law School, Michel Paradis. He's author of the new book, The Light of Battle, Eisenhower, D-Day, and the Birth of the American Superpower. Michel, good morning. It's so great to have you with us. You got a lot of people very interested in this subject around the table, so we'll pass it around. But you got access to archival material that we just haven't seen before. You feel like you know everything about D-Day, especially if you're that interested in it. You read every book, you watch all the documentaries. But tell us what new light you shed on this.
I think the most important light I shed on it was the light on the commander himself. You know, Dwight Eisenhower is this received figure who, you know, has this, he's our grandfather in some ways, and his presidency was certainly defined by being trying to look boring. And the 2 million or more stories that come out of D-Day, the one that I think is the most dramatic and almost relatable to us today is the man at the middle who had to struggle through it all and to project optimism, even though at all times he knew it was on the verge of collapse. That, you know, even on the eve of battle, his chief of staff predicted that there was maybe a 50-50 chance of it succeeding. And had it failed, you know, what world would we live in today?
Right, that's an alternate universe we don't want to contemplate
Absolutely.
at this point. And you get into in the book the planning of D-Day, which it's been well documented. But the fact that they pulled this off, when you really consider it all, it feels almost impossible. You know, there's the head fake that they convinced Hitler they were coming somewhere they weren't. Can you talk about the early stages of the idea and how outrageous it must have sounded to so many people?
It sounded outrageous to most people, most especially the British, who at that point were probably the preeminent empire in the world. And when the Americans came in 1942 and said, here's how we're going to beat Hitler, we're going to cross the English Channel and charge to Berlin, the British were like, no, you're not. We can tell you all the reasons why you can't do that, why it's a terrible idea, and moreover, why I think we're all going to be better off if we start pursuing some British imperial interests in the Mediterranean in the meantime. And so, the plan had been shelved for years, deferred. And finally, at a conference in Cairo in 1943, Churchill and Roosevelt meet for the first time and have essentially a showdown over whether to finally launch this cross-channel invasion. And as a student of diplomatic history, I don't think I've ever read proceedings from a summit that were as acrimonious, where you have 60-year-old men on the verge of a fistfight over whether or not they should continue to pursue operations in the Mediterranean or pursue this high-risk but high-reward operation across the English Channel. And ultimately, a compromise is cut. They decide to go across the English Channel and conduct Operation Overlord. But the first thing that Dwight Eisenhower sees, as both a general and as a student of military history, is it's just way too small. This compromise is shortchanging what they need, and ultimately he has to double the size of the invasion, which becomes probably one of the most sensitive diplomatic things he has to do right as he gets the job. But he ultimately pulls it off, convinces the British to go along, to not only go along with the invasion and support it, but to expand it, and then basically spends the next 5 months getting every detail in place and hoping that everything that he does and that everyone he's leading to do will ultimately come off when the time has come.
So pulling this book together and the research that you did for the book and the research that you had access to, you've got Dwight Eisenhower, career military man. He knows from the moment that General Gavin and the 82nd jump out at 1, 2 o'clock in the morning, he knows that when they land on Utah and Omaha, there's going to be horrific casualty rate. Yeah. What impact, if any, did that have on him?
It had an enormous impact, and this is one of the things that I think is just so admirable about him, because the night before the invasion, June 5th, he gives the order to go. There are predictions. He's essentially betting on the weather at that point, and he personally goes to see off the 101st Airborne. And he's not even recognized right away. He goes up in a very unmarked car, just starts walking between these young men who are younger than his son, who's graduating from West Point the next day. They're all painted up like in war paint. They look like coal miners after a shift. And he walks from man to man, just, where are you from? You know, what do you like doing? Do you like fishing? And, you know, he makes a point as he shakes each man's hand to look them in the eye, knowing, and he's been told that anywhere from a quarter to half of them are going to be killed. And he knows that every other hand he's shaking is a young boy who's not going to have a future, but who's there to you know, do what he's ordered them to do, but ultimately to do, you know, try and save the world. That's literally what was at stake.
We all know the story that Eisenhower prepared the letter about if it had been a failure. What would have been plan B? Just say it hadn't worked. As you said, it was a best of 50-50 call. What would have happened the next day? What would Roosevelt and Eisenhower have recommended? How would the course of the war have changed?
Well, Eisenhower would have been fired, and we would be talking about him the way we talk about General McClellan, probably. But the limits on Allied strategy at that point would be pretty severe. Essentially, the Allies would have to return to the Mediterranean and pursue Great Britain's essentially long-term strategy of expanding Allied influence in Great Britain, using their superior air and naval power to try and strangle Germany, but ultimately leaving the hard ground fighting in Europe to the Red Army. So you would have had a world where Russia was essentially the only counterbalance to Nazi Germany. Whether or not they would have cut a separate piece after seeing the Allies fail so completely, I think is not hard to imagine under the circumstances. And we would be living in just an entirely different world today, with probably the British Empire still as the preeminent sort of power in the world, Russia, maybe even Nazi Germany or some version of Nazi Germany in place for many, many more years, if not decades. Then,
Caddy, so fascinating to hear Michelle describe the fight, the discussion between Churchill and FDR in Cairo over whether or not to do this and how to do it, given that Churchill had spent so many years writing literally love letters to FDR, trying to court him to bring him into the war, got him to Lend-Lease, and then ultimately Pearl Harbor gets the United States into the war. But that relationship so central to this story.
Yes, so central. And another relationship between an American and a Brit that was very central was that between Patton and Field Marshal Montgomery, who you saw there in some of those pictures, who was actually my husband's grandfather. Wow. And I wanted to ask you about that relationship, because I think when Eisenhower appointed Montgomery to be the architect of D-Day, it didn't make Patton very happy. And I was wondering whether that they hated each other, let's be honest. And Monty, as Tom would tell you, Monty was a pain in the rear end. He was not a great, you know, he was a sort of martinet-type grandfather at best. But did that relationship, did the difficulties people had, Patton and Monty, make any impact on the planning for D-Day?
Well, it certainly gave Eisenhower plenty of reasons to smoke more cigarettes. He got up to about 3 packs a day as they were approaching D-Day. But Monty, he didn't choose Monty. He actually advocated for a different British general, and Monty was essentially foisted on him. And a moment ago, I spoke about Eisenhower confronting the original D-Day plan was just essentially too small, and he needed to essentially double the plan. But to do that, he needed British buy-in, and the British were in no mood to expand Operation Overlord. And after Bernard Montgomery is essentially appointed to lead initially just the Canadian and British forces, Eisenhower invites him to his headquarters right after Christmas and essentially gives him a big bear hug and says, Bernard Montgomery, I want you to lead not just the British component of this operation, but the American one as well. Eisenhower, mind you, did not have the authority to make that offer, but he did anyway. And Bernard Montgomery heartily agreed in being the architect of Operation Overlord. And then at that point, Eisenhower said, and don't you think this operation is just a bit too small, certainly for someone like Bernard Montgomery? And so Bernard Montgomery, in essentially December, January of 1944, becomes the face of the expanded D-Day operation, which is ultimately crucial to getting the British buy-in that they need. And again, that sort of political touch that I think we really underestimate with someone like Dwight Eisenhower ultimately ends up being crucial to success.
80 years ago right now, thinking about those young men getting ready to jump out of those planes and go do what General Eisenhower asked them to do. The 80th anniversary is tomorrow. We'll have full coverage of the president's visit and speech there. The new book titled The Light of Battle, Eisenhower, D-Day, and the Birth of the American Superpower. Michelle Parody, congratulations. A fabulous book.
Thank you so much.
Thanks for being here.
Appreciate it.